I hope you enjoyed Quinn's talk and the Q&A with Phoebe. I am so excited to introduce our next speaker, Adam Berry. Adam has worked on tools and infrastructure his entire 20-year career, covering all of the domain that we now call platform engineering, starting with IDE plugins and later moving into build and deployment tools that drastically lower cycle times, especially in organizations that reach scale in terms of humans and code. Adam has just joined Netflix and is shifting focus to remote developer environments and AI tooling and how they will evolve and enhance the development cycle and especially the inner loop. Please join me in welcoming Adam Berry.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the session, AI across the software development lifecycle. So during the session, I'm going to start by taking a little bit of a view as to where I think we're at in terms of adopting AI in our workflows as developers and engineers. We'll take a little bit of a look, especially at sort of the initial effects and signals that we're seeing. And then I'll talk about how I think about evaluating AI tools and onboarding them. And then finally, we'll think a little bit about how we should think about making sure that we're ready for adopting like further tools. So I think the summary statement as to where we're at right now, to crib Jeff Immelt, the former GE CEO, who famously once said, "We're all software companies now." I think we're all AI companies now. The last 2 years since the emergence of ChatGPT and sort of the large language model generative AI tooling, there's been a lot of noise around all of this, but fundamentally, pretty much every company is trying to get AI embedded into its products and is trying to onboard AI-based tooling to enhance the productivity of the people in their business. So this is definitely where we're at. But this is really a case of the disruption has started. I think when you look around, and I think I agree with Gartner's assessment here that we're probably pretty much on the peak of the hype curve, which means that's like the peak of inflated expectations. And so what normally goes along with that stage of the hype curve is that we're in a state of some good and some bad. We've got some mixed signals. You're also normally in a place where there's a lot of unrealized potential. There's a lot of places where these tooling can go that they haven't yet. And then finally, there's been sort of a lot of hype, there's been a lot of noise, and that pushes people to just drive adoption, to just drive onboarding, and not necessarily think too much along that process about whether or not we're getting value. And then as you start to come off of that peak in the hype curve, those questions start to emerge. And so when we think about the fact that for developers, most of the tooling that we've picked up has been sort of generative AI or code tooling. If we think about that in the context of like all of the phases of the software development lifecycle, we see that we're a long way from sort of total coverage here. And so there are some tools that are starting to emerge in some of the pieces of this, but this is really just highlights like, hey, yeah, one of our activities, we've definitely seen an impact and some uptake, but there's a lot more to come. There's a lot more stuff that we can go after. But from even that pickup, it's worth talking a little bit about what seem to be the early signals and the early changes. So across sort of like studies and then the surveys and the reports, and there's a lot of pieces around this, something like a 25% lift in perceived productivity looks to be like a pretty reasonable kind of midpoint where we're at. Definitely some stuff comes in higher, some other things come in lower. If we were to take that number at face value, when we kind of modeled out the fact that, software engineering is about more than writing code, we'd probably be talking something like a 5% lift over the whole cycle. That's significant, but it's not revolutionary, right? So to get to like seriously revolutionary increases in productivity and effectiveness, we're going to have to cover the other phases, which means we've got to get to more activities and more capabilities. But to temper the sort of excitement on that one a little bit, we are seeing a shift in the nature of change that developers who are using these tools are submitting. We're seeing more changes that are also larger. And from what we already have an established models from the Dora 4 metrics, we would expect using larger change sets to result in a drop in essentially the effectiveness side, which is change failure rate and mean time to remediate. And that is in fact like what we're seeing. There's an early signal of a push down. And so I think the really key point on this is, we have the sentiment that says developers feel more productive with these tools, and they're certainly outputting more. But output and productivity or effectiveness are just not the same thing. And we have to be very careful to remember that as we go through adopting these pieces and as we look at these critically, both as people responsible for adopting tools and for the people and as engineers who are going to be using these tools. Now, while we do have additional products that are starting to come in outside of generative AI for coding in places like observability and some automation pieces, I think it's useful to think more in terms of like capabilities that these tools can typically offer, and that can help us sort of get tools that can map to multiple phases. And so for that, to me, that normally splits down to, yep, it helps us write code, write designs, like the generative side of things, where literally the large language models first made their business. The next piece is in helping us sort of navigate and learn and get context on the pieces that we have to deal with day in, day out. And so this is already also quite well covered in terms of code bases, in sort of the chat or Copilot based like tools. It can help explain code to you, explain, how those things work, how they connect together, how you can navigate it. So like those two are pretty well covered, but those are the top two capabilities. There's definitely a lot of room for AI to help us automating toil more cheaply than we can today. For an example here, things like security updates that require of dependencies that require an actual code migration, like an actual API change. Again, there's like emerging tools for this in the marketplace, but that is probably a lot cheaper to automate than if we were going to sort of tackle that ourselves. And that can learn and get better at that over time. And there's a lot of like customization capability inside of businesses where that could be really useful. But yeah, toil automation more cheaply than we can do today is definitely a capability that I think that can come to bear here. And then the last one, as we increase the amount of stuff that we're dealing with as humans, in terms of like we generate more code, we've got more services, those use more resources. We increase the amount of things that we have to track, the amount of information and data that are sort of in our loop of doing our jobs. And so I can definitely see worlds where we have agents and models connected to these sources, and they're doing that filtering, contextualizing, and signaling for us. So Datadog Spitz AI looks like an example of this early on, and I expect to see more of those over time. And so these are the sort of capabilities I think of as like, hey, where these models can really shine in terms of taking the input special to our environment, the context that they have from larger sets, and guiding us and helping us sort of like filter and get more productive through all of those things. Now, in terms of how do we evaluate AI tools to become part of our stack, I actually think this is very close to what I would describe as the usual experimental approach, which I want to spell out. Like, I think we should all be pretty well comfortable with kind of like what that looks like. I think the one couple of things to highlight here is that we want definitely to start from both sentiment as well as sort of performance or quantitative metric as baselines. Both of those things are things that we need to be tracking as we go through this. I think the early adoption has been very sort of vibe based, like, hey, are you happier doing this? This is what we were talking about in the previous slide. There's been generative AI adoption. People are happy about that. They feel more productive, but it hasn't corresponded to performance gains, and in fact, performance drops. So you want to have an established view of those going into any of these experiments. And I think the other piece as you go through the experiment is you have to design in capturing the onboarding cost for folks who are picking these tools up. They present a little bit differently in terms of getting to true effectiveness with them than some things that we would have been used to bringing on board before. And so that's things like, hey, if you need to build and manage a prompt library, like how much did that cost you to kind of get okay at that? If you're trying RAG source management, what does that look like for you? So those are a couple of things extra to sort of call out as particularly important in these experiments. You probably should have been doing that all along anyway for each of these things, but it's especially important as you're evaluating AI. And there's some other considerations that are a little bit different here. So I think one of the things is we look broadly at adopting AI technology and how we compare that to previous ways of technology that we've onboarded in software engineering. For a while, a lot of the things that we picked up have been effectively sort of open source, open box, right? As engineers, teams, and organizations, we've been able to get into the details, into how it's built, and really kind of familiarize ourselves with and sort of build that expertise up and go from there. And at least in sort of the current landscape, these tools are really sort of closed boxes. I think we have a high altitude view as to how they work, but not anything like the same sort of insight into the details internally. And so to me, that means that we really want to be very considerate about our vendor partnerships in terms of what our working relationship with them, how good they are at working with us on like our experiment and our POC designs, a view from them on their roadmap of extensibility and customization is going to be super important for us to build value use over time with these things. We'll definitely want a view as to how they think about quality, repeatability, and performance themselves. Fundamentally, these models behave a bit differently than a lot of software we've been used to using. We kind of get used to, okay, if I give a piece of software the same input twice, I'll get the same output. And that isn't really how these models work. And it certainly isn't true that the same prompts will yield the same results as the model versions evolve over time. And so that partnership as you pick up these vendors is going to be really, really crucial. And I think part of that is going to be like, how are they set up to help you drive and develop expertise inside of your business so that we can move past just being consumers of these tools and being more like partners and sort of collaborators with them. Like, I think that success is that when we feel like we're collaborating with these tools, we're probably in about the right place. And that takes a bit of time and expertise and setup to get to. Now, to think about some things that it's important for us to have in place before we really consider large scale adoption of some things is a couple of things that we have learned is, sort of larger, more established code bases are a little problematic for the models. It seems that comes down mostly to sort of essentially context limits. There is work happening on obviously like longer context windows. There's other things that you can do around RAG document databases. There is stuff that you can do here to help with this. However, it is still just true that like its ability to help you with refactoring and testing, particularly on larger code bases, is a bit hampered. And so you're going to be a little bit left more to the human in the equation to kind of work on those, and particularly with testing. But the good news is on the flip side of this is that if you have smaller, well-tested, coherent code bases, you're in a really good spot for leveraging these tools and getting a big productivity. So from that, it does sort of imply that you want to be in a position that is, as well as having established metrics and sort of sentiment pieces, you want to have like a continual view essentially into what quality for your code bases looks like. So obviously a highly subjective term can mean lots of things like architectural fitness, all manner of things, but that whatever your view of quality is in fact managed, automated, and quantified in this process. And that will help you keep that in a good state over time as you're iterating. Kind of regardless, but it's just even more important as we also bring like AI tooling into it. And to reiterate, you definitely want to make sure your engineering process is observable. So survey and metrics program availability, I just really can't overemphasize how important those are to success over time. Okay, so to wrap up, as you're thinking about adopting additional AI tooling for development and engineering, remember it's not just about code. The other things, particularly observability and debugging, but all parts of the lifecycle, they're rich targets in here. There's a lot of toil and cognitive load we can take off of the people in the process. As you're evaluating the tools, think in terms of the capabilities that can improve and enhance your performance in those phases. Stick with iterative experimental approaches. This has served us well for a while. This is fundamentally what improving your team's performance through DevOps practices is about. And with a couple of additional special considerations, I still think it's a fundamentally sound approach to how we onboard these things. And then the final thing is that even with AI, quality and solid engineering was important, it is important, and it will remain important. And those who are already set up there will get the biggest lift and will be best set up to win. Thank you very much.
All right, Adam. Well, thank you for that. People were really fascinated and they have a lot of questions. Folks, it's a common question. These videos will be posted, so you'll have a chance to watch it again. Let's get started with the questions. We don't have much time. Regarding that 5% lift you talked about, what needs to change for AI to deliver the revolutionary productivity gains that you talked about instead of the incremental ones?
Yeah, I think my stance here is like I haven't seen anything that looks like the classic silver bullet theory, right? Like we'll never have a single set of things that'll give us an order of magnitude lift. And even AI doesn't look yet like it will. So I think we're going to continue to see sort of like these, as we apply things in each of the phases, like these relatively marginal gains that are still significant. But as people pointed out in the chat, they absolutely compound. They are significant. They are valuable. They're just not necessarily like an order of magnitude lift. But I still think that's great.
So basically, you're saying that we accumulate that order of magnitude lift out of a lot of smaller lifts.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Well, hey, I got to know what's on. What's the story for next year, 2025 for Netflix? What are the big Code AI initiatives?
Yeah, so I think I mean it's early days for me there. It's literally like my second week. They had a sort of classic, hey, let's use Copilot as the initial thing, and I think we're just starting to sort of revisit that and think about a little bit more past that. Like, how can we really is Copilot as good as we can do for the Gen AI tooling, and like what are the other places that we can be pulling that into the workflow? Just a little bit like on the context of my talk here as well, but gonna revisit the Copilot question, I think. I don't have anything more specific I can share about that at this point.
Seems reasonable. Seems reasonable. Look, a lot of people have been asking about the CI/CD and DevOps. What is AI offering you in terms of automation and productivity there?
Yeah, so actually my direct experience with this when I just rebuilt a delivery platform has been like not a ton. I think it's a difficult place for the tooling to have like really helpful suggestions to you because a lot of that code doesn't go open source and doesn't sort of enter like the learning phase for these tools. So it's actually a space where as these tools get better at accumulating your enterprise's context, I think there's going to be more value to help people write new pipelines. And I think what was starting to come up, and I think where they'll actually be more valuable is in doing things like the stack trace example, right? Of like, hey, your pipeline emitted these errors, and we're going to flag this to you and explain it to you and help that because your pipelines generate so many signals that like it can be really difficult to kind of like parse out and figure out what's going on. So I think it's more the latter where they're going to be helpful around pipelines.
But we're all hoping that it will become helpful, right? I mean, it's kind of the holy grail, at least on the CI/CD.
Yeah. That was the key thing for me in all of this is like I think there is so much space for these tools to get in and really help us like get filtering through all of this stuff, and that's really what I expect to see happening over the next year, 2 years.
Awesome. Well, Adam, thanks so much. This has been awesome. We're going to end it now so that people can get into the next session. So thanks all, and we will see you in the next session.